So think with me, if you would. Remember somebody who has lied against you. That person who has mistreated you, maybe bullied you in high school, maybe even physically hurt you, that has hurt you so deeply that that's the first person that comes to your mind, that you can't let go maybe sometimes. And now imagine with me, setting aside gender, that you were married to that person, or that the spouse that you were going to get married to began to start treating you like that person. And they started saying bad things about you, hurting you, talking badly about you in public. And they jabbed you, and they mistreated you, and they made you do all the work in the marriage. And so it all snowballed to the pinnacle that you find out that they commit adultery on you. And then they leave, and they come back and they say, I'm sorry for what I did. Maybe some of us might let him back the first time, but then they do it again. And that continues. And eventually their heart gets hard and they leave, and you eventually most likely reject them. Most of us would, right? And this is the context of Israel. God has chosen them. He has made them his people, but yet they have whored after other people. They have abused his name. They have said, you provide nothing for me, so I shall chase other things to fulfill me. And this is the context. See, in Judges 6, that's to be our text, Gideon is not some isolated judge, but he's set in the context of God desiring Israel to come back. And so, though we cannot trust that person who would abuse us and mistreat us, God loves his bride even to the point of coming after her in her point of rejection and hardness of heart. And so we see in chapter 6, verse 1, and it says, the people of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord gave them into the hand of Midian 7 years. So like we said, they did evil. They rejected God. They chased other things. And so God essentially removed his hand of protection and gave them the hand of Midian, or the hand of the contentious brawler, right? That's the name of Midian, brawler, contention. So God hands them over from protection to this brawler. And so all that they're trying to do, provide for their family, have crops and livestock, they cannot stay the hand of Midian. Midian keeps coming and attacking them and sacking them. And so, eventually, it says in verse 6 that, and Israel was brought very low because of Midian. And the people of Israel cried out for help to the Lord. And so Israel is brought to this low point of oppression where they are struggling. But see, don't misunderstand this cry for a cry of repentance because of what they've done to God. This cry is simply a cry because they are under oppression, because their physical livelihood is being taken from them. This cry is like that person who committed adultery to you coming to you and saying, I need money. Hey, will you give me money? Will you get me out of my debt? That's kind of foolish. We wouldn't do that. But listen and look at the graciousness of God. God is so gracious that he sends a prophet to come preach to them. And this prophet reminds them of when they were called and established as God's redeemed people in Exodus. So God brought his people out of Exodus through the plagues, killed the firstborn, spared their firstborn, brought them out, brought them to the Red Sea, got through the Red Sea. All their enemies are scattered against the shore. And so they see the salvation of the Lord. And he's reminding them, you're my people. He's reminding them of this. In verse 10 he says, and I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You shall not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. And so now he's saying to the people of Israel that you fear the people of the Midianites, but you don't obey my voice. And so this is why this oppressive hand is coming upon them. And so God not only sends a prophet and has ties to the story of Exodus, but now he sends Gideon, the reluctant warrior king, the reluctant prophet judge that God sends out. But this is not in a place where you'd find a judge where you'd think maybe this judge would be in the temple repenting of sins. Maybe this judge would be before God crying out. No. Look at where he's at. I'm going to read from verse 11 to 18. And it says, Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Ophrah, which belonged to Yosh the Abizarite, while his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor. And Gideon said to him, Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that the fathers recounted to us, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. And the Lord turned and said, Go in this might of yours, and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Do not I send you? And he said to him, Please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said to him, But I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. And he said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who speak with me. Do not depart from here until I come and bring out the present and set it before you. He said, I will stay until you return. And so Gideon is found in hiding in seclusion from the Midianites. But he's not only found in hiding in seclusion, he's found in the terebinth at Ophrah. The terebinth was a massive tree connected with cult worship. And most likely, his father, Yosh, was lending this land out to the people worshiping Baal. And so he is in this land hiding. He's hiding in this place of turmoil amidst false gods. And it belonged to Yosh's father, which means Yahweh is fire. And he's an Abizarite. Abizarite is father of protector. Remember those two things, because both of those two things are going to connect with the sign that he shows him. And so he's beating out the wheat, he's hiding, and the angel comes to him and says, O mighty man of valor. Now, we know he's hiding, so why is he saying this? Maybe it's comical because Gideon's name means mighty man of valor. And so maybe he's playing on that, or maybe he knows he's going to be a mighty man at times. And so he says this to him, and then Gideon is remembering maybe the prophet that just preached. He's remembering the Exodus story, and he's saying, why is this not happening like the prophet said? Why are we not being freed? Why are we oppressed by Midian? He neglects to see that the oppression's because of their disobedience. And so then he tells him to go and send out, and this is also reminiscent of Moses, right? Remember before Moses left to take the people out of Israel, what did he say to God when God said, send him? He said, what? I can't speak. I'm weak. I'm a murderer, right? And he said, how can I go to these people when I'm a murderer? And so Gideon is saying, how am I, the weakest clan, the smallest clan of Israel, how am I going to go and rescue the people? But does he know what comes out of the smallest clan, right? And so he's in this point before God, and yes, he's fearing. And so he asks for a sign, right? Many people judge Gideon for the sign, but God doesn't judge in this point for the sign. God allows him to go seek after a sign. And place yourself in the Second Great Awakening. Does anyone know what happened during the Second Great Awakening? During the Second Great Awakening, revival was happening, but also Christianity was being divided. All of these different denominations were spurring up, and they were standing in the marketplace saying, I'm Baptist, I'm Assemblies of God, I'm Methodist, all follow me, I have the right way. Even Joseph Smith was saying, right, I saw an angel appeared to me, and he tells me it's the right way. So now place yourself in Gideon's feet. He's in the midst of all of this idolatrous worship, right? And Baal's being worshipped all around, and he's not sure if this is really the right angel, or if this is really the right God to be worshiping. So he asks for a sign. And the sign that he asks for connects with the Passover. There are things that are seen. The young goat that he brings, right? The goat that they killed and they slaughtered the blood. The unleavened bread. So he takes the meal and he takes the meat and the unleavened bread and he sets it on the rock. And the angel tells him to set it there and pour the broth over it. And so what does he do? Remember, Yahweh is fire. He burns up the offering And Gideon realizes that this is truly Yahweh. And he turns and he steps forth in obedience. And what is the first thing that Yahweh does? He does not free his people from the oppression of the Midianites first, right? He first purges them of their idols. He tells Gideon, go and destroy their altars, essentially saying, go and destroy this false temple of worship. And so Midian wisely recognizes if he goes during the day, he's most likely not going to be able to do this. And maybe there's some fear in there. So he goes during the nighttime and destroys this, breaks down the altars. Well, look at what the people of Israel do. The people of Israel don't repent and say, oh, God has destroyed our idols. It must be Yahweh. He must be right. No, they come to his door and they knock on his door and say, hey, we did some CSI work. We figured out it was your boy Gideon. And the father basically says, why does Baal need you to come? And they're like, oh, you're right. Why does he need us? And so then Gideon is named Jerubbaal, right? Which means Baal will be against him. And so he's saying he's the champion over Baal, over this idol. And so God's king is champion over this idol. After this experience, Gideon is waiting. He's a guy who is searching and looking the horizon to see if the Midianites are going to come. So he's resting, he's waiting, and he sees them, and the Holy Spirit, like the Iron Man suit, clothes him. He takes the trumpet, and he blows, and he calls all the armies to himself, all the armies from the nations of Israel to come and to contend against Midian. And many of them come. But even after this, even after he takes control of him, he goes and he puts a fleece out, and he tests God. Now, it never says whether it's a good or a bad thing. So I'm going to let you figure that out. The text never says that. So he tests God. And so whether or not he tests God does not matter, because after he tests God and has a sign confirmed, he makes big leaps of obedience. Like Hebrews says that he was a man of faith. The next steps, he makes some big leaps. And so then after he has this massive army compiled, he obeys God, even though the impending force have masses just as big, or if not bigger than his forces. He starts dwindling them down. God does some signs and dwindles them down, because God says, I want the glory in this battle, not you. So God dwindles it down, and he is stepping out in obedience. Imagine, the forces grow smaller and smaller and smaller, and you have this impending force. The fear would probably cripple most of us. But Gideon does not. He trusts. And guess what God does? Gideon doesn't ask for this. God sends Gideon a sign. And so Gideon sends the man down to the Midian army, down to Purah, and he goes and he listens to this crazy dream. It's ridiculous. It doesn't even, if you read in the text, it doesn't necessarily make sense. It's like a ball of hay comes and crashes in, and that's proof that the Israelites are going to beat the Midianites. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but God brought that as confirmation to Gideon, to confirm him, to solidify his faith. So he steps forward, and he moves forward with an even more insane battle plan. Gideon's battle plan is not, we have 300 men, let's build a big thing to attack them. No, it's like, let's get a torch in a jar, and let's get a trumpet. All 300 of us, let's get this. And you follow me with this torch and this trumpet against the masses that they say is like locusts upon the field. And so they all go, and they split up into 100, all 300. They go, and they drop this, and they blow the trumpet, and they said, the Lord is going to defeat you and Gideon. And so then God causes this massive army to turn on themselves. And the text says in verse 22 that when they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade. Well, this is crazy. And the men start running. And they just start running as far as they can get away from this. They're like, there was masses of us, and there are 300 of them. And we're still running, and we're killing each other. And God obviously, comically, is defeating them with 300 men. There's nothing that Gideon has that's special. And so then Gideon calls those armies that he dwindled down, he calls them back. He calls those armies back and says, let's chase them down. So they start chasing them down. Well, I can imagine in the time of lull, in the time of rest, the Ephraimites rise up and they're like, whoa, you 300, you got all the glory from this. Why didn't we get anything? And Gideon calms them down and says, look at all the spoils of war you got. Look at all this gold. So he basically shows them gold and talks to them about the spoils. And is like, look what you guys have done too. You defeated many of them. And so they're like, oh, okay. Basically, they're trying to glory thief what God wanted to do, what God already said. I dwindled down the army so he wouldn't glory thief. The Ephraimites are already glory thieving. And so then they continue pursuing the armies, right? Gideon pursues, and his army pursues really far, and they get exhausted and tired. And so they go to the men of Succoth, and the men of Succoth mock them, saying, why should we give you food? You haven't defeated the armies. You're 300 men. You're chasing them. Why should we give you food? And then he goes to the men of Palal. Well, he promises the men of Succoth that he's going to beat them with thorns, and he's going to kill many of them. And then he goes to Peniel, and they do the same thing. And he says, I'm going to break down this tower, and I'm going to kill you. I don't know. Take that as you will. And so then he goes, and he continues to chase the army. And God God's sovereign hand shows them and hands in the kings to them. And all the armies are like spazzing out because they're like, what in the heck's going on? Our king just got taken by 300 men. What's going on? You know, they don't know what happened either. So they start freaking out. And so instead of killing these kings first, Gideon, a little crack in his character, goes to take his retribution that he promised, right? He goes to take this, and he says to the men of Succoth, this is evidence that he was not obeying God, because he would have said, you sinned against Israel, you sinned against us. He says, you taunted me. You taunted me. Me, Gideon. Look at me. You know, you taunted me. And so then he goes and he beats them with the things, and he breaks down the tower. He beats them with the thorns, and he breaks down the tower, and he kills many of them. And after that, he takes the kings before him, and he doesn't say, you know, when David's before Goliath, what does David say? The Lord's going to deliver you into my hand. The Lord's going to beat you. The Lord's going to defeat you. No, he says, you killed my brothers, right? It's like, what, Migo Antoyo? You killed my father. Prepare to die. Right? No, you killed my brothers. You killed my relatives. If you hadn't killed my relatives, I wouldn't have to kill you. And so he goes, and he takes them, and first he gets his son to try to stab him, and then his son doesn't do it, so he goes and stabs them. But clearly the Lord's hand was upon this. So after the battle, after everything settles down, Gideon goes back to the land of Israel. Gideon goes back to the land of Israel, and the people come out to him, and they say to him, basically, essentially worshiping him, and they say to him, right here, check with me in verse 22 of chapter 8. And he says, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, you and your sons, and your grandsons also, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Gideon said to them, I will not rule over you, my sons will not rule over you, the Lord will rule over you. Finally, Gideon says something good. And then Gideon said to them, let me make request of you, every one of you give earrings of his spoil. So, the Israelites, reverberating with their Baal worship, turn their Baal worship to Gideon and say, you, in dynasty-like fashion, start ruling over us. Not the Lord rule over us. No, he says, you rule over us and your sons, because you delivered them. Apparently, they didn't get the memo, and they didn't see the battle. That 300 men with trumpets and with torches destroyed masses. They didn't get the memo. They failed to see God. And Gideon rightly recognizes at this point, and he says, but the Lord will rule over you, right? But then he makes a mistake. Gideon failed to heed the warnings of Exodus, the requirements of a king not to take gold. And he failed then later to take concubines, because he's not supposed to take concubines. He does both of those in contrast with what he's supposed to do. And so he takes this, and he might be doing good in making a napod, which is a monument. He might be making this monument to remember the battle and remember what the Lord has done. But instead, he does not realize that the people of Israel are worshipers. That the people of Israel are still reverberating in their minds and their hearts the worship of Baal. And so they turn from the worship of Baal, and they start worshiping this monument. And they start worshiping this great achievement that Gideon's done in delivering them. And they falsely attach the defeat of the Midianites with Gideon and this statue. They totally miss what God is doing. The whole story, they fail to see what God is doing. They're blind. And Gideon only sees little pieces in his faith. And so then the concubines, he takes concubines towards the end of his life, and he dies. and that statue was a snare to his family, the people turn and they start worshiping Baal again. They start worshiping Baal-berith, make them his god. And it says in verse 34, and the people did not remember the Lord their God. When did they even think about him? The whole story. They didn't even remember him, who had delivered them from the hand of all the enemies on every side. And they did not show steadfast love to the family of Jerubbaal, and in return for all the good he had done. And so contrary to God showing them steadfast love, they neglected to show steadfast love to God and steadfast love to their neighbor. And they started worshiping idols. I appeal to you, brothers, that we do the same thing. Maybe it's seminary students, maybe in America we think we don't have statues to worship. We don't have Baal to worship. We don't have these false gods to worship. But I tell you we do. They're within our hearts, and we worship them above God, above Yahweh. But I hope that you realize this, that Jesus is the true warrior king who delivers the people, and that he is worthy of worship, and so we should turn from our idols and we should turn to him. Let me say that again. Though Gideon failed, Jesus is the true warrior king who is worthy of worship, and so we should repent of our idols and we should turn to him for what he's done. And though Gideon left his work incomplete, and he did it sinfully and broken at times, Jesus does all of the things that Gideon was supposed to do, but he does them perfectly. Look at the text. Jesus, sent by the Father, non-hesitantly, sent by the Father before the foundation of the world, he was told to come. He came stepping out in faith, not hesitantly, not fearfully, knowing who Yahweh was, knowing who it was because he is God, very God. And he comes, and what does he deal with first? Do you remember when Jesus was on earth, the Jews wanted him to take away the oppression of the Romans, right? The same thing that these people wanted to do with the oppression of the Midianites. But Jesus has to deal first with sin and idols. And so Jesus dealt with sin and idols perfectly, as a way that Gideon was supposed to deal with them and fails to totally deal with them. Jesus dealt with them. Jesus lived a perfect and sinless life and was that atoning sacrifice. He died and rose again, proving he had the power of sin and death and over idols, destroying and smashing every idol. Our enemy, our greatest enemy is sin. So what are the idols that we worship? An idol is this: anything you look to and say, if I just had this, I would be comfortable. If I just had this, I would be happy. If I just had this, it would make me feel better. It would make me hopeful. It would satisfy my soul. This is what we look to. What is that we look to? As seminary students, I believe and I fear that this is it because I know it's in my heart. We worship the position to be a pastor. We worship this idea of a godly man, a godly pastor. And so we think, if I graduate seminary, if I am just have a good enough congregation, look at me. And so we find comfort, and even sometimes we become self-pity and beat ourselves up because we fail to reach that image of what a pastor is supposed to be like. And so what one pastor has said is, behind every sin, there's an idol we worship. Behind every idol, there's a lie about the gospel that we're disbelieving. And so beneath our sin, sometimes our pride, sometimes our laziness, sometimes our impatience, sometimes our misuse of our families, and sometimes our self-pity. Beneath that is the idol of approval of man. We find our identity as pastors, and we worship that identity, and it cracks. And that's why pastors leave in 3.5 years. The heart of my heart and the heart of many of us is we worship the identity of a pastor. And so Jesus defeated that. We fail to see that Jesus was the faithful shepherd, that he defeated sin and we don't have to approve. Because of Jesus, we stand before God righteous. We don't have to work. We don't have to be pastors. We don't have to be better. Jesus approves of us. He looks upon us. The Father looks on us because of Jesus and says, you are righteous. You don't have to find your identity, and you don't have to have these giftings. Stop trying to be somebody else. Rest in me. Quit worshiping this false identity. And so he destroyed that, and he died, and we died to sin, and we died to these idols, and we live in newness of life. And now we worship God, and we have a relationship with him, and we covenant with him. And so Jesus starts with our idols, and then eventually he comes back, right? Revelation. He comes back on a white horse, and he gets all the glory. It's not like Jesus and all of us come with swords and all of us fight the enemies with Jesus. No, Jesus just speaks and his enemies fall. Jesus just speaks and they all crush, and the blood comes up to the horse's mount. Jesus destroys all of the enemies. So he destroyed sin and he destroyed the enemy. So let me ask you, what enemies are you trying to defeat on your own? The control that you're trying to do over your own sin. The control over certain aspects of your character that you're trying to control, when Jesus promised to defeat that. When he promised, I defeated your sin, and I'm ultimately going to defeat your enemies. What fear are we letting control us that we're not speaking the gospel to the lost? That we're letting that control us, and that we're worshiping the approval of man and the fear of man, and we are not worshiping God. And so at the end of the story of Gideon, right, it's chaos. They go back to their idolatrous worship, right? I think we do the same thing. But ultimately, this is what Jesus is going to do. When he defeats his enemy, and when he calls us home and brings us home, we're going to be around the throne. All nations, all peoples from all nations worshiping God. And it's not going to be sin and brokenness. He's going to wipe away every tear and every fear that we had. We find comfort in God and worship him. And so we find hope, brothers, in Jesus, who is the true warrior king, who defeated our idols, defeated our sin. We don't have to find identity in them, but we find hope and rest in God. And we don't struggle with sin because it's defeated. We don't struggle with idols. We turn from our idols and we worship God and we worship Jesus because he is the perfect and true warrior king, worthy of worship, better than Gideon. Thank you, guys.